Picture the postcard. Then dirt stretching to the horizon, a river carving through sandstone gorges that look like they belong on another planet. Somewhere out there, a town sits quietly in the heart of Australia's top end, and every year, thousands of people fall in love with it from a screen. They see the gorge cruises, the golden light at sunset, the promise of a slower, wilder life, far from traffic jams and crowded cities, and then they move there. What almost nobody tells you is what happens next. Because the people who actually try to build a life in Katherine, Northern Territory, learn something the travel brochures leave out. This isn't a place that gently tests your patience. It's a place that tests your body, your bank account, and eventually, your mind. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why so many newcomers pack their bags and quietly disappear within their first year. We're talking about heat that doesn't just make you sweat, it changes how your body functions. Isolation so total that a flat tire can become a genuine emergency, and a local ecosystem where the wildlife has already decided what it thinks of you. This is the version of Katherine nobody puts on a postcard. Let's get into it. Katherine sits about 320 kilometers south of Darwin, right where the Stuart Highway cuts through the top end on its long, lonely run toward the center of the continent. On a map, it looks almost reassuring. A proper dot, a real town, connected by a real road. But maps lie. They flatten distance into lines and numbers, and they say nothing about what that distance actually feels like when you're living inside it. Katherine is often described as the fourth largest town in the Northern Territory, a regional hub built around a military base, a handful of industries, and a river that gives the town its name and its identity. For a visitor passing through on a road trip, it's a welcome stop, fuel, food, or look at the gorge, and back on the highway within a day or two. For a resident, it's something else entirely. It's a place where the climate doesn't cooperate with your plans, where help is never as close as you'd like, and where the romance of outback living runs headfirst into logistics nobody warns you about. So before you start imagining a new life under the top-end sun, let's talk about what that sun actually does to a person first. Katherine doesn't really have 4 seasons. It has 2, and neither of them is mild. For much of the year, especially in the lead up to the wet season, temperatures push well into the upper 30s and low 40s Celsius day after day, with barely a break at night. Locals call this period the build-up, and the name says everything. Humidity climbs alongside the heat until the air itself feels heavy, almost solid, like walking through a room that never stops steaming. This isn't the dry desert heat people picture when they think of the Australian outback. It's tropical heat, thick with moisture, the kind that clings to your skin and refuses to let go even after the sun goes down. Your body's normal cooling systems start working against you. Sweat doesn't evaporate the way it should because the air is already saturated. Simple outdoor tasks, mowing a lawn, walking to the car, unloading groceries, can leave you drained in a way that a Melbourne or Sydney summer never quite matches. Then the wet season arrives, usually somewhere between November and April, and the entire equation changes again. Monsoonal rain doesn't drizzle here, it pours, in violent sustained bursts that can dump more rainfall in a single afternoon than some cities see in a month. The Katherine River, normally a gentle, photogenic feature of the town, can rise dramatically during these months, and in significant flood years it has cut off roads, isolated neighborhoods, and forced entire sections of the community to fend for themselves until the water recedes. Imagine planning your week around whether the road out of town will still be passable by Thursday. Imagine watching the sky for weeks, not out of curiosity, but out of genuine concern for whether your street will still be dry tomorrow. That's not an occasional inconvenience in Katherine. That's a seasonal reality, one that returns every single year, whether you're ready for it or not. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The heat and the flooding aren't separate problems. They're 2 halves of the same brutal cycle, months of suffocating dry heat, followed by months of relentless water, with barely a comfortable window in between. Endure that rhythm long enough, and it stops feeling like weather. It starts feeling like a test you're quietly failing. But surviving the climate is only step 1. Because even if you adapt to the heat and the rain, there's a second problem waiting, one that has nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with how far away everything else actually is. Here's a number that sounds simple until you actually live it. Katherine is roughly 3 hours by road from Darwin, the nearest major city, and that trip runs entirely along a single highway, the Stuart Highway, cutting through vast, empty stretches of bushland with very little in between. Now ask yourself what that means on an ordinary Tuesday. It means a medical emergency isn't just frightening, it's a logistics problem with a countdown attached. Katherine does have a regional hospital, and it handles a great deal locally. But for serious trauma, complex surgery, or specialist care, patients are often looking at transfer to Darwin, whether by road or in urgent cases by air. When every minute matters, 3 hours, or worse, delays caused by flooding, closed roads, or weather grounding a flight isn't a minor inconvenience. It's the difference between a manageable crisis and a genuine catastrophe. It means something as mundane as a flat tire on the Stuart Highway can turn into a survival situation. Out there, mobile phone coverage thins out fast, traffic can be sparse for long stretches, and the heat we just talked about doesn't pause because your car broke down. People die on remote Australian highways every year, not from dramatic accidents, but from being stranded, underprepared, in conditions that punish hesitation. And it means everyday life comes with a hidden tax. Freight has to travel a long way to stock Katherine's shelves, and that distance shows up in the price of groceries, fuel, building supplies, and virtually anything that isn't produced locally. Businesses factor transport costs into everything they sell. Residents absorb it quietly, bill after bill, without ever really noticing how much remoteness costs until they compare notes with a friend living in a capital city. This is the part that catches people off guard. They picture isolation as peaceful, space, quiet, room to breathe. What they don't picture is vulnerability. The sudden realization that you are, in a very real sense, on your own out here, and that the safety net most Australians take for granted gets thinner with every kilometre you drive north from Darwin, and thinner still with every kilometre south into the interior. And once you understand just how alone you really are in Katherine, the next question becomes unavoidable. Alone with what exactly? Katherine sits on a river system, surrounded by gorges, wetlands and bushland, and in Australia's top end. That combination means one thing above all else: crocodiles. Saltwater crocodiles, despite the name, thrive in freshwater systems throughout the Northern Territory, and the Katherine River and the wider Nitmiluk Gorge system are no exception. These are apex predators, ambush hunters, capable of explosive speed over short distances, and they don't distinguish between a careless tourist and a long-time local. Signage along the river isn't decorative. It's a genuine, constant reminder that the water, beautiful as it looks in every photo, is not neutral territory. It belongs to something else. For residents, that means an entirely different relationship with the outdoors than most Australians experience. A cool swim on a hot afternoon isn't a spontaneous decision. It's a calculated risk, dependent on which stretches of water are monitored, which are known crocodile habitat, and which have had recent sightings. Locals learn this quickly, or they learn it the hard way. And crocodiles are just the headline threat. Step off a paved path in the surrounding bush and the danger list grows fast. Venomous snakes that are common throughout the region, extreme dehydration that can set in within minutes under direct sun, and terrain that offers very little margin for a wrong turn or a twisted ankle far from help. Combine that with the isolation we just covered, and you get a simple, sobering equation. In Katherine's backcountry, small mistakes carry outsized consequences. None of this means the region is uninhabitable. Indigenous communities have lived alongside this landscape for tens of thousands of years, developing deep, careful knowledge of how to coexist with it. But that knowledge takes time, humility, and respect to build. It isn't something a new arrival absorbs in a few months of enthusiasm. And until it's earned, the wilderness around Katherine doesn't offer forgiveness. It offers consequences. So the land itself is dangerous, the water is dangerous, and the distance to help is enormous. Surely then, the town itself offers some kind of stability. Unfortunately, that's where the next problem begins. Katherine's economy runs on a handful of pillars, and every one of them comes with built-in volatility. Tourism is seasonal by nature. Visitors flood in during the dry season to experience Nitmiluk Gorge and the surrounding attractions, then the numbers drop off sharply once the wet season arrives and travel becomes harder. For anyone working in hospitality, retail, or tourism-adjacent industries, that means income that swells and shrinks with the calendar, not with your personal financial needs. Then there's RAAF Base Tindal, the Royal Australian Air Force base just outside town, which brings genuine economic weight to the region, defence spending, personnel, and associated jobs. But reliance on a single institution of that size also means the town's fortunes are tied to decisions made far outside Katherine, in Canberra, shaped by defence priorities that have nothing to do with the needs of local families. Outside of tourism and defence, career diversity thins out quickly. Specialised professionals often find limited local opportunities in their field, which pushes many toward fly-in, fly-out arrangements, remote work, or simply leaving. But meanwhile, the cost of living tells its own story. Housing, utilities, and groceries all carry a premium shaped by the same remoteness we discussed earlier, the same freight costs, the same limited competition among suppliers, and infrastructure hasn't always kept pace with the town's needs. Growth in a remote hub like Katherine runs into real bottlenecks. Road capacity strained by flooding, utilities stretched during peak tourist season, services that work fine for a modest population but struggle under sudden pressure. Put simply, the financial promise of cheaper, simpler living in the Outback often doesn't survive contact with reality. Wages in specialised fields can lag behind capital cities, costs run higher than expected, and the job market offers a fraction of the flexibility people are used to elsewhere. It's a slow erosion, a little more expensive here, a little more limited there, until people realise the sustainable financial future they imagined isn't actually taking shape. And once the wallet starts feeling the strain, it's rarely long before something else starts to strain too. This is the part almost nobody talks about, because it doesn't show up in a single dramatic moment. It builds slowly, quietly, until one day it's simply too much. Small towns everywhere carry a certain intimacy. Everybody knows everybody, and there's very little anonymity. In a place the size of Katherine, that intimacy intensifies fast. Your business becomes public knowledge quickly. Privacy, something city dwellers rarely think twice about, becomes a genuine adjustment. For some people, that closeness feels like community. For others, especially those used to the anonymity of a larger city, it starts to feel like living under a microscope. Then add the climate back into the equation. During the peak of the wet season, when roads flood and the heat refuses to relent, people spend far more time indoors than they ever anticipated. Cabin fever sets in, not from choice, but from necessity, because stepping outside genuinely isn't practical or safe for stretches at a time. Combine restricted movement with oppressive humidity and a much smaller social circle than newcomers are used to, and the isolation stops being scenic. It becomes suffocating. This is precisely why relocation stories about remote Australian towns follow such a familiar pattern. People arrive with excitement, drawn in by the beauty and the promise of a simpler life. Within months, the daily friction starts accumulating. The heat, the distance, the flooding, the financial strain, the shrinking social world. And for a striking number of newcomers, the first 12 months become a quiet countdown to leaving, rather than the fresh start they imagined. It isn't weakness. It's a mismatch between expectation and reality, the gap between the postcard and the lived experience, between a week-long visit and a permanent commitment. Katherine, for all its natural beauty, asks more of its residents than most people are prepared to give. And it asks for that commitment every single day, in every season, without exception. So after all of this, the heat, the isolation, the crocodiles, the cost of living, the psychological toll, where does that leave the dream of moving to the top end? Katherine is genuinely stunning. Nitmiluk Gorge, the river, the wide open sky at sunset. None of that is exaggerated in the photos you've seen. As a destination, it earns every bit of its reputation. But there's a meaningful difference between visiting a place and building your life inside it. A tourist experiences Katherine's beauty for a few curated days, then leaves before the heat becomes exhausting, before the wet season traps them indoors, before the isolation starts to weigh on their mind. A resident doesn't get that exit. They live inside every version of Katherine. The furnace, the floods, the distance from help, the financial strain, the loneliness, for as long as they choose to stay. That's the real lesson buried in this town's story. Geography and climate aren't background details. They shape what's actually possible for the people who live somewhere, whether or not the postcard version admits it. Katherine isn't a failure of a town, it's a demanding one, built for people who fully understand and accept what they're signing up for. For everyone else, there's nothing wrong with loving it from a distance. Visit the gorge, watch the sunset, take the photos, then go home, grateful you got to experience it without having to survive it. So here's the real question worth asking yourself. Could you actually last 12 months out there? Or would the Outback dream quietly break, the same way it has for so many before you? Let us know in the comments. And if you've ever tried relocating somewhere remote, we want to hear how it really went.